Well, post 9/11, there's been growing awareness of terrorism, both in the United States and incidents in the United States, like the Boston Marathon bombing, but also here in this country. What's being done in this country on counter-terrorism? Well, the National Post had an interesting article that looked at that very subject when they discussed it with the RCMP. Christian Leuprecht is going to be joining us on that subject. Christian Leuprecht is a professor and an international security expert at RMC and Queen's University. And Christian, good to see you today. This is called the High Risk Traveler Case Management System. What is it?
Well, so CSIS has been on the record since April 2012 as saying that they're following perhaps in the order of a couple of hundred individuals who they think are either at risk of leaving the country or have either returned from elsewhere or are currently abroad that may be engaged in terrorist activity or intending to join up with terrorist organizations. And so this represents a significant shift because previously we've only heard from CSIS that they are actively following individuals. But when the investigation shifts to the RCMP, it suggests that there's now sufficient evidence to start a criminal investigation. And of course, Parliament changed the law recently, and it is now illegal, for instance, to leave the country with the intent of joining a terrorist organization. So what this suggests is that the new toolkit that we have given our security sector is now likely going to result in indictments and arrests and hopefully also convictions against individuals who are looking to engage in activity with the intent of engaging in violent extremism.
Okay, let's talk about that toolkit a little bit because I don't know whether it necessarily translates to arrest. I'd love your opinion. Because denying them passports, that seems like a nuisance kind of a thing. Putting them on a no-fly list, immigration proceedings, and then potentially any kind of criminal charges. I mean, is this an aggressive enough approach?
Well, I mean, the RCMP is not an organization whose major task is to create nuisances for Canadians who might be engaged in activity that is unbecoming. The RCMP's main task is as a law enforcement agency. And so there are two strategies at work here. One is if you engage in, for instance, making life difficult on the password side or you put people on your fly lists, it means that they will now, in return to, for instance, get their names off these lists or engage in other means of travel, that allows, or for instance, trying to then reactivate accounts, email accounts and whatnot, that leaves a trail by these individuals. And it leaves a trail of evidence that the RCMP can now collect and on which the RCMP can now start to build a case against such individuals so that it can actually bring charges. Because there's no point for the RCMP to bring charges against individuals simply on grounds of suspicion. It only makes sense for them to bring charges if there are reasonable grounds that they're actually going to get a conviction. And getting a conviction means not just collecting the evidence, but collecting it in a manner that is in accordance with our Constitution, and that since the Stinchcombe decision in 1991 means that the RCMP will have to provide full disclosure of all the materials, all the notes, everything that it has gathered in the process. So it means that this indictment, any sort of arrest will also need to stand up against any charter challenges and charter violations to ensure that the indictment actually stands.
But we haven't seen any charges laid yet, as I understand it. When do you anticipate that could happen?
So these investigations can take some time, but usually not too much time, in part because you usually have a close team of people who work on these files. And so the longer you work on a file, the greater the risk is that somewhere, somehow, something might spill out, or that, for instance, the journalists or the media or so might catch on to something. And so these investigations might take anywhere from a number of months to perhaps a year and a half, 2 years, I would say, at max. Precisely because you need to keep the investigation moving both on public security grounds, and you need to keep the investigation moving so as you don't actually tip off the individuals that it is not just CSIS that is watching them, but that there's actually an active criminal investigation evidence gathering process in place.
Okay, if that's the case, we do know that Canadians were involved in the Algerian gas plant takeover, for instance. I mean, how many people you say 200 people are being watched, but how many are actively in conflict zones, if you will? And then how many are just coming back to Canada and then spreading the word here?
So this is a great question to ask. We do have a report from King's College London, from their counterterrorism center, for instance, on Syria, that estimates somewhere in the area of about 600 Europeans fighting in Syria, and about 60 of them with the more radical elements. We have different types of reports out of the State Department that have associated literally thousands of Americans being abroad and fighting with various types of or being engaged with various types of extremist organizations. So the numbers are sort of hard to come by, but we do have sufficient open source intelligence from our allies, from the French and the Germans, to suggest that a number of countries are very actively following these files. And so that we're not just talking one or two individuals here, that we're talking at least in the dozens and possibly in the hundreds. And of course, there's three types of risks that we're engaged in here. One is the people who are in Canada who may be looking either to leave Canada or engage in violent activity within Canada. Then there's the people who are fighting abroad, and inherently when people are fighting abroad, it's somewhat difficult for us to gather evidence that might subsequently convict them when they come back to Canada. So the best that we can do is keep an eye on them and try to do our best to track their steps, but then also to be aware of them when they return to Canada, because of course here they might engage in radicalizing others, perhaps engage in violent extremism, perhaps engage in collecting money, weapons, other types of support for organizations abroad. And so there's a whole spectrum here. And what Parliament has done is try to pass laws that not just allow us to convict people, but that are meant to act as a deterrent against people engaging in such activity to begin with. But to act as a deterrent, we also need to make sure that at some point we enforce these laws and try to bring charges against individuals who may be engaged in such activity.
You know, our European allies, and I'm thinking Germany in particular, have taken different approaches. They have some of the same stuff, but also different approaches in terms of, I know Germany has a program called Exit that allows people that might be involved in radicalized groups per se to get out of those programs. Does Canada have anything along those lines?
Well, the most famous program is probably the Saudi program, but there are other countries that have such programs among our allies. I think in Canada, it seems that we don't have large enough a program that we need to run deliberately a de-radicalization program. These programs are somewhat controversial also because it's not clear exactly how much of an incentive they provide for people to de-radicalize. I mean, if you tell somebody we're going to lock you up, or you go into this de-radicalization program, chances are that the incentive is pretty strong for them to sign up for the de-radicalization program. So whether people actually change their mindset in the process is difficult to gauge. But it also suggests that in Canada we haven't had the critical mass of people to actively have to run or attempt to run this sort of program. The RCMP's approach has been somewhat different in the sense that they've really been trying to work with local communities through their community policing and community engagement program to make sure that communities feel comfortable working with the RCMP and reporting to the RCMP activities, behaviors, or communications by individuals within their communities that they think might be suspect.
Like a snitch line almost.
Well, yes and no. So Canada's taken, compared to several European countries, compared to the Spanish, for instance, a different approach in the sense of that these are two separate activities. So that the RCMP has the community engagement branch, which works with communities, but these are not the individuals who then do any type of investigation or intelligence gathering. And the RCMP makes it very clear that the officers that are sent into those communities are not there to gather intelligence. They are simply there to build relationships with the community. And when or if you do have intelligence to share, they will provide the contact with which to share that intelligence, but they don't want precisely to communities to think that the purpose of the officer being in that community is to gather intelligence. And as we know, for instance, from the NYPD or so, these types of quasi-community engagement, but at the same time intelligence gathering programs, on the one hand, can get police departments into trouble, and on the other hand, can really sour relationships with local communities. And so the RCMP has quite deliberately engaged in sort of this two-track approach, which seems to have yielded some very good returns, in part also because several of our allies have come to Canada to watch what the RCMP is doing on the radicalization front with this sort of two-track approach.
Okay, but if that's the case, wouldn't it be better to separate the two? Shouldn't that be the domain of the RCMP to do the community outreach, as you're describing it, and CSIS to do the more nefarious efforts?
So CSIS is a security intelligence gathering agency. It is not a law enforcement agency per se, because CSIS does not have powers of arrest. CSIS also is allowed to gather certain types of evidence in ways that would otherwise be considered unconstitutional. And so, by and large, the evidence gathered by CSIS cannot stand up within a court of law. And so this is why it's important, for instance, as we started this conversation with regards to the RCMP's engagement with these individuals, that it is only the RCMP that has both the powers and the ability to gather evidence to make sure that this evidence stands up in a court of law. And so CSIS has much broader powers and ability to survey people, but they don't then have the subsequent powers of arrest, for instance, that the RCMP has, and they don't have the setup whereby they would then go out and collect evidence that would stand up in a court of law. And so it's very important to understand the difference between these two organizations, and why in Canada we have made a deliberate effort to separate the security intelligence function from the law enforcement function.
Christian, thank you for explaining that to us. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Christian Leuprecht from Queen's University and RMC, where he's an international security expert.